Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to our seminar series. My name is Susan Broomhall. I'm the Director of Women and Gender History Research Centre at Australian Catholic University, and I'm a member of this project team. Welcome to our second seminar in the Swedish Research Council project, Moved Apart, Communicated Experiences of Separation in the 16th and 17th Centuries. As that title indicates, our project studies expressions of separation in East Asia and Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, examining people's experiences of separation at different stages of life, in different times and spaces, and how the experience of separation was communicated through letters. The 16th and 17th centuries saw an increase in global mobility that connected the world in new ways. Mobility increased both within East Asia and Europe, and also between the two regions. Historical studies have often focused on this mobility and on the encounters and connections that it led to. Our project reverses this bias. Distance in time and space means separation between people. With this focus, different consequences of mobility are made visible for those who moved and for those who remained. Both experienced separation. Our approach to globalization also allows more attention to the experience of women as those who are most often remained behind. As part of our project, we're hosting this seminar series, which is a mix of invited guests to stimulate us and those who wish to join us in our thinking, and at other times we'll be presenting the fruits of the project's work as we move along. So today, this evening for me, for morning for Mary, we're really thrilled to have Professor Mary Weisner-Hanks to accept our invitation to speak today in our seminar series. I'm sure you all know that she's Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the Department of History. She's a brilliant scholar of women and gender and of global history, and we're so pleased that she's also a member of this project's International Advisory Board. I will not recount her very full CV, which I'm sure you already know, but I will draw your attention to two major works that she has coming out this summer. So first of all, the 4-volume Cambridge World History of Sexualities, co-edited with Matthew Kerfler, and her own Women and the Reformations, A Global History with Yale University Press. So we're really thrilled and grateful for Mary to speak with us today with her paper entitled Gender, Intersectionality and Global History. I'll turn my mic off. I think everyone else already has. And so the floor is now yours, Mary. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sue. And also thanks for the invitation to this. So I couldn't have been there for an earlier meeting, but here we go with this. So I'm going to talk a little bit over half an hour, and then there'll be some time for questions after that. And I'm not going to talk about Asia, but I'm going to talk mostly about a different part of the world. And I hope that you'll be able to sort of see where the implications for what you're working on with Europe and Asia connections. So scholarship that presents itself as global, world, transnational, imperial, international, overseas, or entangled history, or as histoire croisée or Transfergeschichte, has generally been less interested in social structures than in issues rooted in political, economic, technological, and military history. Among the social structures that have received relatively little attention from world and global historians, and I see them as the same, world and global history, have been those associated with gender and sexuality. Conversely, historians of gender and sexuality have been comparatively thin on the ground among those who regularly examine issues on a global scale. They generally choose to study individuals, families, circles of friends, or other small groups, and have been worried that these would get lost in large-scale narratives that tend to emphasize impersonal processes. Studies of gender and sexuality that use global or transnational or world to describe their scope are often comparative rather than synthetic, generally edited collections with chapters or articles on different parts of the world. As we were developing and editing the 4-volume Cambridge World History of Sexualities, which, as Sue says, out later this year, Matt Kiefler and I discovered that it was often very difficult for scholars of sexuality to expand beyond their own area of expertise to write general chapters on, say, sexual violence or erotic art or sexuality in Islam. All of those, by the way, we have chapters on, and there's a wonderful chapter in the Cambridge World History of Sexualities on sexuality and emotion written by Katie Barclay. Highlight that there's, yes, the emotions are there. I've explored the reasons for this lack of intersection several times, as have others, and I can send to Sue and James a longer and slightly different version of my talk that's going to appear in Historical Journal, so you can have the footnotes. Despite this lack of connection in the past, however, Scholarship that draws on both world and global history and the history of gender and sexuality is beginning to appear. Some of this scholarship is also intersectional, explicitly or implicitly utilizing the concept that first emerged in the writings of Black left feminists, that the nature of oppression is multiplicative rather than additive, and that no one identity, gender, race, class, sexual orientation, religion, ability, and so on should be considered apart from other identities. This idea was part of the thinking of feminist groups that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. In 1977, the Black lesbian feminist Combahee River Collective asserted in a statement mostly written by Barbara Smith, quote, "We are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppressions, and see our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based on the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the condition of our lives." In 1989, the critical race theorist and feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw called the synthesis of oppression intersectionality. She's the one that coined that word. The concept and the word slowly spread into other academic fields and eventually into public consciousness. From its roots kind of in academia, it went to the women's movement, and now intersectional feminism has become a way that people describe themselves on their Facebook pages, X and Tumblr posts, and buttons and t-shirts. It's all over the place. Along with moving from academia into popular culture, intersectional epistemology has also become increasingly global, analyzing and critiquing structures of power and oppression that arise from a variety of situations. Scholars have not simply used social groupings drawn from the Western past and present, but have elaborated social categories taken from local understandings as well. To Barbara Smith's sort of big four, race, class, gender, and sexuality, scholars have added religion, age, grace, ethnicity, and other factors as key social structures operating in the societies that they study, past and present. They've also subtracted one or more of the big four, arguing, for example, that gender as it is understood in the West was not an important category of analysis or oppression in many sub-Saharan African societies, or that certain Southeast Asian groups had non-dichotomous understandings of sexuality and gender, or that class has little value as an analytical concept, distinguish elites and non-elites in whatever place and time they study. In this more global intersectional scholarship, third world and transnational feminism have provided key theoretical insights. Both critique the underpinnings of colonialism, imperialism, and nationalism, including those that contributed to the rise of Western feminism in its various waves. Transnational feminist scholars have criticized single-pronged analysis that focus only on gender, highlighted multiple and complex vectors of power, and underscore the importance of respecting the agency and voices of women of color. Drawing on post-colonial history and theory, they have examined processes of subordination, the impact of global migration on families, individual and institutional cross-border networks and dynamics, gendered and sexualized nationality, and many other topics. Research influenced by queer theory has explored ways that states produced and continue to produce sexual and gender identities, often at their borders, when they let in or do not let in individuals identified as belonging to certain groups, such as the homosexual or those who challenge kind of the natural gender order of male and female to present themselves as trans. In her recent discussion of intersectionality in science, however, Vrushi Patil highlights the disproportionate amount of intersectional scholarship that still focuses on the global north, especially the United States, along with its predominant focus on one community or country and inattention to cross-border dynamics. Thus, she notes, quoting her, complications in how intersectionality shapes international, regional, and forces. Someone has their mic on, I think, still. Because that's not me. Complications in how intersectionality shapes international, regional, and global forces, processes, institutions, and organizations, as well as connections between these scales and more local scales, remain largely unexamined. This is certainly true, this kind of still disproportionate amount that's still on the global north, though to some degree her conclusions, like all conclusions, are based on her methodology, which started with a keyword for intersectionality in OCLC databases. So she only finds intersectionality where she's looking for that word. I would suggest that along with some scholarship on non-US topics, it has been explicitly intersectional. That is, it situates itself theoretically within the development of the concept and using that word intersectional. There's also scholarship that has been implicitly so, investigating ways in which two or more social systems operate together in shaping structures of power, but not necessarily describing this as intersectional. All right. One place where it's relatively easy to see various social hierarchies intersecting are laws about intermarriage and other sexual relationships between social groups, and how these were constructed, maintained, ignored, subverted, and challenged. Such laws begin with the world's earliest written law codes in the ancient Near East and continue to today. Whether in ancient Babylon or modern Brazil, they draw lines between social groups, between slave and free, noble and commoner, high elite and middling elite, native and newcomer, black and white, citizen and non-citizen, married and unmarried, and many, many others, making heterosexual relations between these groups, however these groups are defined, non-normative, that is, prohibiting them or somehow advantaging the children born from these relationships. I mean, only very recently have we in English stopped labeling children born from some of these relationships as illegitimate. That's what the word means, not legal. Thus, they are one of the earliest and longest lived methods of social stratification. Because the concerns of the elite men who wrote these laws revolved primarily around the inheritance of property and privilege, laws initially only regulated heterosexual relations that could produce children. Later, various moral, political, and religious concerns would be added to such laws, and to some places, same-sex relations would be regulated as well, but this was not as pressing a matter. Laws and rules about intergroup sexual relations were generally written in gender-neutral terms, but their enforcement was often highly gendered, with the behavior of women in more elite groups the most closely monitored, and the men in elite groups the least. Women and men also had differing opportunities to ignore and contest them. Laws about sexual relations between groups also changed as local and global processes transformed society. As Jennifer Boynton has commented with respect to laws regarding racial groups, and this is from her chapter on race and sexuality in our Cambridge Oral History of Sexualities, she says authorities regulate sex across the color line in continuous reaction to contemporaneous geopolitical and sociopolitical realities. So today I want to look at one particular place in time where global entanglements led to sexual relations that created new social groups and new attempts to regulate these. That's the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. These social groups are generally described as racial hierarchies, but class figured in them as well, or at least a social hierarchy involving wealth, land ownership, and family background, whether you want to call that class or not. Sometimes these sexual relations created families, and sometimes they did not or were prohibited from doing so, which put the women and children in them at a disadvantage. But they also created affective ties that could provide women and children with opportunities. Thus, sex, race, class, and gender all shape these hierarchies. So, to these. Spanish and Portuguese colonists brought with them ideas about social difference and hierarchy formed in Europe. Late medieval European chroniclers and lawmakers writing in Latin used words such as gens and natio to refer to groups that differed according to language, traditions, customs, family, kindred, and laws. Nation and people, which is sort of Englishing gens and natio, continued to be commonly used words to describe human differences in the early modern period, though color and complexion and other words were used as well. In English, the word race was also used to describe national groupings like the French race and the Spanish race. You're familiar with that from your own work, I'm sure. Or other social groups like the race of learned gentlemen or the race of mankind. Recently, some medieval historians have argued that race was invented in the Middle Ages or even in the ancient world, actually, though others point to the early modern period as the time when people began thinking of humans as divided into a small number of groups based on continent or place of origin, skin color, facial features, and other physical or behavioral characteristics, thus creating the modern notion of race. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this debate going on right now about when did race start. Okay, which I'm not going to get into. Commentators recognized that traditions, language, and customs, though, could change, and some began to describe differences not just with race, but in terms of blood, German blood, English blood, and so on, which made difference heritable. Blood was also used as a way to talk about the position in social hierarchy, of course, especially for nobles who are understood as having noble blood and taught to be concerned about their bloodlines. Membership in these groups was to be maintained by endogamous marriage, and sexual relationships that crossed lines were prohibited or viewed as aberrant, particularly if they involved women from whatever group was viewed as superior and men from a group deemed inferior. In terms of social position, those of noble blood were prohibited from marrying commoners. There's been a whole bunch of work on blood recently. Were prohibited from marrying commoners in many parts of Europe, and sometimes even nobles, and Svante, of course, know this really well from your own work, whose status was too different from their own, so that high nobles couldn't marry people who weren't such quite high nobles. Though, of course, there are all sorts of ways to get around this for male members of the elite, as there always are ways for male members of the elite to get away with anything. Religious beliefs also came to be conceptualized as blood in late medieval Europe, with people regarded as having Jewish blood, Muslim blood, or Christian blood. The most dramatic expression of this in Europe was in Reconquista Iberian Peninsula, where, purity of blood, which means having no Muslim or Jewish ancestors, became an obsession, as descendants of converts were reviewed as tainted because their religious allegiance was carried in their blood. Laws restricted the activities of new Christians, that's, converts and their children, including marriage and other sexual relations. Describing differences as blood naturalized them, making them appear as if they were created by God in nature rather than by humans inventing social hierarchies. After the Reformation, Christian blood was further subdivided into Protestant and Catholic blood. My students always laugh about this, but people, children born of religiously mixed marriages were often slightly mistrusted, for one never knew whether their Protestant or Catholic blood or their Calvinist or Lutheran blood would ultimately triumph. Such mistrust was often gendered. The City Council of Lutheran Strasbourg, for example, prohibited women from marrying Calvinists, quote, in their words, because she would let herself be led into error in religion by her husband and be easily led astray. Though it allowed men to, in other words, a Lutheran man could marry a Calvinist woman, quote, because he can probably draw his spouse away from her false religion and bring her onto the correct path. Not only did blood carry religious identity, but so did other bodily fluids. Fathers choosing a wet nurse for their children took care to make sure she was of the same denomination, lest if he was Catholic, her Protestant blood turn into Protestant milk and thus infect the child with heretical ideas. Bodily fluids are fungible. One turned into the other in the early modern understanding of this. Okay. Europeans brought their ideas about difference with them to the Americas, of course, but they were not entering empty lands. So I think this has been a really big change in the way that we sort of view this stuff, is that we're now paying much more attention to what did people think already. Indigenous people of what became the Spanish colonies had their own systems of social difference, linked to family and sometimes to blood. Like Europeans and like most other peoples of the early modern world, the Taino, that's the original inhabitants of the Caribbean, made social distinctions between nobles and commoners, a status passed down through family lines. Taino were ruled by leaders the Spanish called caciques, a word that comes from the Taino word cacique. No, they were nobles whose power came from an inherited position, from the amount of land and people they controlled, and from networks of alliances based on family and matrimonial ties. In other words, they're just like the Habsburgs. So this existing social system is there. Other indigenous people in Meso and South America had similar hierarchical, heritable social systems, commoners, nobles, and some kind of leaders, for whom the Spanish also used the word cacique. So they took this Taino word and used it all over Latin America. From colonial era sources, it appears that these elites were endogamous, just as they were in Western Europe. Among at least some Mesoamerican people, including the Mexica, that's the Aztecs and the Maya, rulers were understood to have special blood, and rituals developed in which they shed blood to ensure the harvest and success in battle. Among the Maya, this included queens as well as kings. Among the Mexica, rituals involving human blood, including human sacrifice, increased in frequency and size in the 15th century and became more associated with men. Male war captives were seen as the most pleasing to gods for sacrifice, favored over enslaved men or women of any status. Thus, the Mexica, like the Spanish, were used to thinking about blood as a powerful force inherent in a person, related to social standing and to some degree to gender. Okay. Given deep suspicions among elites in Iberia about any kind of mixing, The Spanish and Portuguese crown hoped to keep Europeans and Africans and indigenous people apart in their American colonies. The gender balance, though, among both European and African immigrants made this impossible, however, and authorities quickly just gave up. Sexual relationships involving European and African men and indigenous and African women produced a wide array of mixed-race children. The response of colonial authorities was first to try to ignore them, but that wouldn't work, and then to create an ever more complex system of categories called castas for persons of mixed ancestry. So in most of the Spanish American colonies, about 1/4 of the population was casta, mixed race, by the end of the 18th century. It's important to remember, I think the majority of the population is still fully indigenous. It lasts a long time. The Catholic Church and Spanish officials defined as many as 15 or 20 different categories and combinations that were in theory based on place of birth, assumed geographic origin, status of one's mother, with a specific name for each one of these kind of categories. Mestizo, mulatto, cabalco, on and on and on. The various castas and the relationships among them were clearly delineated in treatises and by the 18th century in paintings produced primarily for a Spanish audience that shows scenes of parents of different castas and the children that such parents produced. Sure, you're probably all familiar with them. If not, Google casta paintings, or here's one, which I used on the second edition of Gender in History. So this is one of these many, many casta paintings. They're beautiful. Because they were meant to be decorative, paintings sometimes showed marital couples that rarely existed, such as a European woman with an African or fully indigenous man. They showed men, women, and children wearing clothing and with objects that represented their imagined ancestral group, and with postures and gestures viewed as appropriate to their gender, which did not vary much from painting to painting. Thus, they referenced norms of acceptable masculinity and femininity, along with commenting on racial mixture. I think they're often just simply read as talking about race, and they're not. It's huge amounts of gender and sexuality conveyed in these. By portraying society as made up of marital couples and their children, and all the casta paintings look like this: one man, one woman, one child. And usually the woman's holding the child, and there's all sorts of stuff, and the clothing is wonderful. People use them for all sorts of other kind of historical research. But by portraying society as made up of marital couples and their children, casta paintings created models of heterosexuality and nuclear households that were very different from the realities of colonial life. Thus, in legal and other texts and in art, colonization discursively produced social categories that were in theory rooted in the embodied experiences of men, women, and children, but sometimes relied more on the imagination of writers and artists. All right. The casta system in the colonies built on earlier Iberian notions of purity of blood. Just as the blood of conversos and their children was tainted, so was that of indigenous Americans. Loyalty to traditional beliefs was often described by Spanish colonial writers as the result of, here's quoting, bad seed that has grown deep roots and has turned itself into blood and flesh in the Indians, a vice that comes in the blood and is suckled as milk, through which the customs of parents and ancestors are converted into nature and transmitted through inheritance to their children. So it's this idea about blood. So thus, the more indigenous blood you had, the greater the danger. Here in that quote I just read to you, the author also worries about indigenous milk, although this was less often a concern than it was for European Protestants, perhaps because European background families relied so much on indigenous African and mixed race wet nurses, they couldn't be too fussed about that. The system was not just one of difference, but also hierarchy, with the amount of indigenous and or African blood a determination of status, at least in theory. However, determining the proper casta in which to place actual people was not as easy as setting this out in some sort of treatise or painting, for the treatises and paintings were attempts to impose order on a confused and fluid system. They weren't a description of reality. In some cases, the system became untethered to people's actual origins. Asians who came across the Pacific in the Manila galleons, for example, were generally called chinos, though most of them are not Chinese, but enslaved people from the Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asia. Excuse me. Over time, however, the category Chino came to be viewed as a type of mixture of African and indigenous, and Chinos came to be treated under the law as indigenous, which meant they were vessels of the Spanish crown and could not be enslaved. So their Asian origins are just completely forgotten. Oh, excuse me. In practice, the category in which one was placed was largely determined by how one looked, with lighter-skinned mixed ancestry persons often accorded a higher rank than darker, even if they were full siblings. So many historians have kind of termed the social structure that developed in colonial Spanish America, including the Caribbean, a pigmentocracy, based largely on skin color and facial features and hair texture rather than on actual family origin. Sorry. Okay. But as intersectional and transnational feminist theory, historical research, and our own experiences make clear, one hierarchical system is always interwoven with others. They often reinforce one another. This is the point sort of intersectionality isn't understood, but sometimes they work at cross purposes. Since one's ability to marry or inherit, or enter a convent or a priesthood or attend university relied on official determination of ancestral purity, what caste did you belong to? Individuals not only passed as members of a higher group if they happened to be light skinned, but they also sought to officially whiten their social status to obtain privileges in society. They could do this most easily, of course, with money. In many areas, families of property and status bought what was called a glacius al saca, a royal exemption that allowed them to be considered descendants of Europeans, regardless of their ethnic appearance or ancestry. The Catholic Church officially forbade indigenous African and mixed-race children from becoming priests, but then decided that those with only 1/4 native ancestry would be considered Spanish, and also occasionally granted licenses for money, of course, that made other mixed race men white. Individuals thus moved from Indian to Mestizo to Spanish in a racial hierarchy that was complicated by class, or at least by access to money. Spanish authorities also tended to recognize the power and privileges of indigenous leaders who cooperated with them, giving them the title cacique, and sometimes even the Spanish noble honorifics don and dona, and giving male leaders entailed estates, which included land and subject labor. Thus, much of the indigenous social structure was maintained, at least for those willing to support Spanish colonial authority, and particularly for the men among them. So in the theory of the casta system, purely indigenous people rank lower than those who had some Spanish blood, but cacique status trumped that, particularly when this was reinforced by what had always marked nobles in Spain, land ownership. No, noble blood is noble blood. Kind of race just doesn't matter. Church authorities supported this, limiting entrance to convents to pure-blooded women from cacique families, along with those of European background, and excluding mixed-race people. All right. So just as money and family status both reinforced and worked at cross purposes to racial hierarchies, so did sexual and other intimate connections. Castas are created through sex, heterosexual reproductive relationships, but intimate relations could also upset or subvert them. Intimacy is a fraught subject in colonial settings, given the enormous power differences and often violence involved. But as Penny Russell comments in her chapter on colonialism, sexuality, and our Cambridge World History of Sexualities, she writes, the fluidity and instability of colonialism produced pockets of intimacy, opportunity, erotics, and freedom, as well as of dominance. These were always informed by, even shaped by the context of colonialism, and thus inherently problematic. But to ignore the way individuals manage these imbalances, finding livelihood, intimacy in even pleasure or love, and the interstices of the aggressive transformation wrought by colonization in all its forms, would be to ignore the history of how human beings continue to be human, even in the bleakest conditions. Okay. The intimate relations most likely to leave sources were long-term heterosexual ones because they produced children. On the Upper Guinea coast of West Africa, for example, female entrepreneurs, known as Sinar usually, played key roles in trade, using their social status, kinship ties, and business acumen to become critical cultural and economic brokers between the African interior and the Atlantic coast, and eventually across the Atlantic. They formed long-term sexual unions with Portuguese traders that were understood as marriages, receiving bride wealth from their husbands rather than providing a dowry. The women acted as power brokers and business partners, connecting their husbands with regional trading networks in goods and slaves, and their mixed-race children, male and female, often continued as prominent traders, marrying each other or French and English traders who moved into the area. One of these signars, a woman named Anne Rossignol, for example, who died in 1810, is a prime example of the possibilities of transatlantic commerce for free women of color. She was critical in the development of Gorée, the French West African colony where she was born, and then she brought her wealth and her entrepreneurial experience and her big family across the Atlantic to Saint-Domingue, where she purchased real estate and slaves. Mainland Spanish America also offered possibilities as well as repression. In the cities of colonial Peru, thousands of enslaved women and men used legal claims and money to secure their freedom and that of their children, negotiating the legal categories of the casta system to their own advantage. Mixed-race children and sometimes their indigenous or mixed-race mothers traveled back to Seville and other parts of Spain, creating chains of migration and networks of obligation that went in all directions. I should say Jane Mannion's Transatlantic Obligations, Creating the Bonds of Family in Conquest Area Peru and Spain traces a lot of these, and I think also touches on exactly what your project is doing, what issues of separation meant. If you haven't read it, you should read it. So, money, land, and access to other sources could thus lead to a change in status, and so could affective and emotional ties. Perceived conformity or nonconformity to behavioral standards could as well, especially for women. Indigenous holy women, such as the Mexican mystic Catalina de San Juan or the Mohawk Algonquin convert Catalina Tegaguatha, were thought to have become white after death as a sign of their holiness, while women who engaged in magic were described as black, whatever their ethnic origin. Less extreme religious or moral behavior could also change one's family or social standing, easily dragging it down and changing marriage and employment prospects, even for distant cousins. Okay. None of this negates, I want to say, the enormous power of race in determining new social groups that developed in the Spanish colonies in the Americas, nor does it discount the violence of colonialism. But other hierarchies interwove with race, generally reinforcing racial hierarchies, but sometimes offering opportunities for people to alter their social status or create alternative social groups that gave their life meaning. This complexity would probably not have been surprising to people at the time who viewed social status, what they call calidad, not as fixed or unidimensional, but as resting on a precarious balance of physical, family, and moral judgments that shifted over time. In other words, we would say calidad is intersectional. So a couple of conclusions. Scholars of intersectionality have asserted that it is a tool that can and should be used to examine and critique every social structure. I'd agree, but I'd also argue that it's particularly effective for certain times and places. The early modern Spanish and Portuguese colonies are one of these, as is the early modern world in general. Now, as Sue sort of said in her introduction about the project that you're doing, the early modern era was characterized by mobility on an unprecedented scale. And everywhere there was movement, new groups were created through sex, despite efforts to prevent this. These groups are shaped by complex interactions of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, and other factors. Many recent studies of Iberian colonialism and the colonialism, migration, and trade of other places examine at least some of these interlocking structures of power and categories of oppression, so are to some degree intersectional, even if they don't use that term explicitly. The research project to which you are all connected is exploring one facet of this movement, that is, experiences of separation that have left a historical trace. Those experiences will be rooted primarily in existing relationships, familial relationships, sexual, friendship relationships, patronage, business, political, or whatever, or in relationships established as a result of the movement. If there's no relationship, there's no sense of separation, right? You're not worrying about it if you don't have any relationship to this thing. Those relationships are embedded in interlocking structures of power, and every person involved in them occupies a multifaceted position in many of these structures. So whether the person you are studying is a Nuremberg merchant in a family firm who traveled widely around Europe while his wife maintained things at home, or a Spanish nun who traveled with other nuns across the Atlantic and the Pacific to the Philippines and then to Macau to establish convents, those are both people who left letters that discuss their experiences of separation. The Nuremberg merchant was whiny, and the Spanish nun is very upbeat and wonderful. I can't really understand how to analyze these relationships and experiences in a way that's not intersectional. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really wonderful. And I'm sure it's going to generate many questions. So, James, if you're